Fine, let's start. Number 1. Ritual Intoxicating Enemas. Picture a painted clay vase from the Maya world, made sometime between 600 and 900 of the Common Era. On its curved surface, a lord reclines while an attendant kneels behind him, pressing a small bag against his body. For decades, this scene puzzled people who saw it. Then the scholar Peter First, working alongside the Maya expert Michael Coe in the 1970s, offered an explanation that most museum guides still hesitate to say out loud. The bag held an intoxicating brew, and it was being delivered not to the mouth, but to the rectum. The Maya and other cultures of the ancient Americas gave themselves enemas to get drunk and to see visions. The art historian Francis Robichsek later cataloged a whole series of these enema scenes across Maya ceramics. So this was not one strange picture, but a recurring ritual theme. The reason behind it is oddly logical. When you drink alcohol, your stomach and liver break much of it down before it reaches your blood. And if you drink too much, your body protects you by making you vomit. Deliver that same alcohol through the lower intestine, and you bypass both defenses. The drug enters the bloodstream faster and more completely, and there is no way to throw it back up. Prehistoric and early ritual practitioners had discovered, without any chemistry, one of the most efficient and most dangerous routes into the human body. The reconstructed apparatus was simple: an animal bladder or a rubber bag tied to a hollow bird bone or a narrow gourd. What went inside is still debated. One strong candidate is balche, a mead brewed from fermented honey and the bark of a tree called Lonchocarpus. Another is an infusion of wild tobacco, the species Nicotiana rustica, which carries many times the nicotine of a modern cigarette and can push the body to the edge of poisoning. Some researchers suspect morning glory seeds or water lily were added for their dreamlike effects. Far to the south, the Moche people of Peru painted their own versions of these scenes, showing that the habit arose more than once. Some scholars go further and suspect that the secretions of certain toads, rich in a compound called bufotenin, were among the ingredients delivered by the same route for their powerful effects on the mind. Spanish chroniclers, writing after the conquest, described feasts where nobles drank until they could drink no more, and then continued by other means. A number of the strange bulbous vessels in museum collections have narrow spouts better suited to insertion than to pouring, quiet confirmation of what the paintings show. It was tied to ritual, to the crowning of kings, to war, and to speaking with the ancestors. It sounds invented. It is drawn on their own pottery. And it raises a question, because if people would do that to their bodies for a ritual, what else would they permanently do? Number 2. Ritual Sub-Incision. Some habits pass through the body and are gone by morning. This one never leaves. Among many Aboriginal Australian peoples, the passage into full manhood involved an operation called Sub-Incision, in which the underside of the penis was cut open along the line of the urethra using a stone blade. The anthropologists Baldwin Spencer and Frank Gillen documented it in detail among the Arrernte people of Central Australia around the year 1900, recording a rite they heard called Mika. It was not the first cut a boy endured. Circumcision usually came earlier, and sub-incision followed as a higher and more severe grade of initiation, often performed on teenagers crossing into adult life. The wound was sometimes deliberately reopened and enlarged over the following years, so the mark deepened as a man aged. Blood drawn from it was not waste, but a sacred substance, poured over ritual objects and used in ceremony. Some observers recorded that the reshaped opening changed how a man urinated, forcing a squatting posture. Different peoples across the continent, the Warlpiri, the Wik, the groups of the Western Desert, each held their own forms of the practice, woven into totemic beliefs and the sacred narratives of the dreaming. The knowledge was guarded, kept from women, and from boys who had not yet been initiated. Why endure this at all? The answer sits at the center of the rite. The point was endurance itself. To take the blade without crying out was to prove you were fit to carry adult responsibility and adult secrets. The permanence was the message. A body that had been changed forever announced a mind that had been changed forever. Anthropologists once searched for hidden practical reasons, guessing at hygiene or population control, and those ideas were largely set aside in favor of the plain truth that this was ritual and social, not medical. The antiquity is the part that unsettles people most. Soft tissue does not fossilize, so no ancient sub-incised body survives to be dug up. But the Aboriginal presence in Australia now reaches back at least 65,000 years, confirmed at the site of Majidbebe, and the practice belongs to cultural traditions of enormous depth. Genital modification is, across the whole of anthropology, one of the most widespread and most ancient categories of body ritual known. Colonial and missionary pressure drove much of it into secrecy in the 20th century, and yet the habit reveals something about the prehistoric mind, a willingness to reshape the flesh permanently in the name of meaning. Which leads to a claim about the body stranger still, that early humans may not have stayed awake through winter at all. Number 3. The prehistoric human hibernation hypothesis. In December of 2020, 2 respected researchers published an idea that sounded like science fiction. Antonis Bartsiokas and Juan Luis Arzuaga proposed that early members of the human family may have hibernated, slowing their bodies through the deep cold of glacial winters, much as a bear does in its den. Their evidence came from one of the richest fossil sites on Earth, a cave shaft in the Atapuerca Mountains of northern Spain, called Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of the Bones. It holds the remains of at least 28 individuals, dated to roughly 430,000 years ago, belonging to an early branch of the Neanderthal lineage. When the 2 scientists examined the bones, they reported patterns of interrupted growth, lesions, and layers that suggested the skeletons had repeatedly slowed and then resumed their development on a seasonal cycle. They compared these features to the bones of mammals that hibernate, and pointed to signs of kidney disease and disrupted mineral chemistry consistent with long months without sunlight and vitamin D. The proposal was that during the worst of the Ice Age, these people retreated into the caves and let their metabolism fall into a torpor, a slowed state of reduced heart rate and temperature that carried them through the season of no food. The objections came quickly, and they are serious. Many physiologists argue that an animal as large as a human, with a brain that demands enormous and constant energy, simply cannot hibernate the way a small mammal or even a bear does. Others note that the very same bone lesions could be explained by ordinary starvation, disease, or vitamin D deficiency, with no hibernation required at all. And there is a living counterexample, because the Inuit and other peoples of the far north survive brutal winters wide awake. Bartsiokas and Arzuaga answered that they were not claiming a perfect bear-like sleep, only a shallow or intermittent torpor. The site itself is extraordinary regardless of the debate. It gave us the famous complete skull, nicknamed Miguelon, and some of the oldest human genetic material ever recovered, which confirmed the link between these people and later Neanderthals. The bones show cut marks and appear to have been gathered in one place, hinting at one of the earliest known treatments of the dead. The markers the authors leaned on, growth arrest lines running across the shafts, and pitted defects in tooth enamel, are the standard language archaeologists use to read seasons of stress in a skeleton, which is exactly why the same evidence can be argued both ways. Whether or not our ancestors truly slept through winter, the hibernation idea grew from real marks in real bone, marks left by seasons so harsh they were written permanently into the skeleton. And harshness of a different kind explains the next habit, because some of our ancestors deliberately ate a poison. Number 4. Mad honey intoxication. There is a honey that can stop your heart, and people have been eating it on purpose for thousands of years. It comes from bees that feed on certain rhododendron flowers, whose nectar carries natural poisons called gray anotoxins. These compounds lock onto the sodium channels that fire nerve and muscle cells, and in the right dose, they bring dizziness, tingling, hallucination, a plunging blood pressure, and a dangerously slowed heartbeat. The classic source is the Pontic Mountains along the Black Sea coast of what is now Turkey, near the modern city of Trabzon, where the local product is still called deli bal, meaning mad honey. Its power is not a modern discovery. The Greek soldier and writer Xenophon recorded it around 401 before the Common Era. As his army retreated through this region, the men ate honey from local hives and collapsed in their hundreds, vomiting and raving, unable to stand, as if the whole force had been drugged. Modern toxicologists have compared his account to real cases of gray anotoxin poisoning and found the match almost exact, one of the rare moments where an ancient text can be checked against chemistry and passes. A few centuries later, around 67 before the Common Era, forces allied with the King Mithridates reportedly turned the honey into a weapon, leaving tempting combs in the path of Roman soldiers under Pompey, then attacking once the men had eaten and fallen. Behind these dramatic stories is a much older relationship. Humans have raided wild hives for tens of thousands of years. On a cave wall in eastern Spain, in a painting from roughly 8,000 years ago, a tiny figure climbs a set of ropes toward a hive while bees swarm around, risking everything for the sweetness inside. Somewhere in that long history, people learned that honey from certain flowers did more than feed them. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder wrote of honey that drove men mad, and correctly tied its danger to the region and the flowers that produced it. In the wider ancient world of Anatolia, fermented honey drinks were a mark of elite feasting, so the line between a prized luxury and a lurking poison could be dangerously thin. Traditional users in the Black Sea region still take deli bal in tiny amounts, a smear on a spoon, for claimed effects on vigor and blood pressure, and for a gentle intoxication. Take too much, and it can bring fainting, seizures, and a heartbeat slow enough to kill. What makes mad honey so striking is that a single, natural substance was at once a food, a medicine, a weapon, and a drug. Its meaning shifting with the dose. Because honey stores and travels well, its dangerous varieties could move far from the flowers that made them. It is one of the oldest intoxicants our species can claim, older than beer, older than farming. And if people would eat a poison for its effects, it may be less surprising that they also, quite deliberately, ate the ground. Number 5. Habitual Geophagy. Across the world, in nearly every human population that has been studied, people eat earth. The habit is called geophagy, and far from being a sign of madness or starvation, it is now understood as a piece of sophisticated folk pharmacology. Traces of it show up in the hardened waste and the worn teeth of ancient people, and it is shared by many of our primate relatives, which suggests its roots run very deep, quite possibly into the Old Stone Age. The key lies in what clay can do inside the gut. Fine clays, such as kaolin and smectite, are powerful binders. They latch onto plant toxins, bitter alkaloids, and even some pathogens, sweeping them out of the body before they can do harm. This is not folklore. It is the same principle behind old anti-diarrheal medicines built from kaolin. In the high Andes, people learned to dip wild, bitter potatoes into a slurry of clay so that the earth would soak up the poisons the plant used to defend itself, turning an inedible tuber into a meal. The biologist Timothy Johns studied this detoxification effect closely, and his work reframed dirt eating as a clever technology rather than a disorder. Geophagy carries other associations too. It is strongly linked to pregnancy across many cultures, perhaps to supply scarce minerals such as iron and calcium, or to calm nausea, though eating too much clay can also block the very minerals it is meant to provide. Chimpanzees at Gombe eat particular soils, sometimes together with medicinal leaves, which gives us a living model of how the habit might have begun. In parts of Africa, the preferred earth comes from termite mounds, prized because it is fine, rich in minerals, and relatively free of contamination. People mined favored clays, processed them, sometimes baked them, and traded them as a valued good. There are real dangers. Eating soil can bring in lead, parasites, or cause an intestinal blockage, and the balance between benefit and harm is delicate. But the sheer universality of the practice, appearing on every inhabited continent, argues that it was not invented over and over by accident. It was more likely inherited from a deep common past. Even the classical physicians in the tradition of Hippocrates mentioned earth-eating, and today you can still buy tablets of edible clay in some markets, a direct descendant of a Paleolithic habit. From swallowing the earth, we turn to something colder and stranger, the deliberate collection of the skulls of monsters. Number 6. Cave bear skull cults. Deep inside certain European caves, explorers have found the skulls of enormous bears arranged in ways that do not look accidental. The most famous case comes from a high alpine cave in Switzerland called Drachenloch, dug between 1917 and 1923 by Emil Beckler. He reported chests built of stone slabs, and inside them the skulls of cave bears, apparently placed there on purpose. The animal in question, Ursus spilius, the cave bear, was a giant, with large males reaching 400 to 500 kilograms, and despite its size, it was mostly a plant eater. Beckler's finds gave rise to a dramatic idea that Neanderthals had kept a cult of the cave bear, gathering and venerating its skulls in the dark. The image is unforgettable, and it should be treated with care. The great prehistorian André Leroy-Gourhan was among many who doubted the cult, and modern specialists in how bones move and settle over time point out that flowing water, shifting sediment, and the bears themselves could pile skulls into what only looks like an arrangement. Beckler's excavation was also crude by today's standards, which weakens the evidence from Drachenloch specifically. But the story does not end in pure skepticism because of Chauvet. In that celebrated painted cave in France, a single cave bear skull sits squarely on a flat block of stone, as if placed on an altar, in a layer more than 30,000 years old. Almost everyone who studies it accepts that a human hand set it there. The floors of Chauvet are littered with dozens of bear skulls, and the shallow hollows where the animals hibernated and sometimes died. So the bears were a massive presence in these people's world, and at least once someone singled out a skull and gave it a place. Cave bears were abundant beyond imagining at some sites, with the remains of tens of thousands of individuals accumulated over the ages. The animals finally vanished roughly 24 to 27,000 years ago, overlapping the time of both Neanderthals and modern humans. Bears sit tangled in the whole question of early symbolism, right down to a controversial cave bear thigh bone from Divje Babe in Slovenia, pierced with holes that some argue is a Neanderthal flute. Bear reverence echoes forward through later Eurasian cultures, from the bear ceremonies of the Ainu in Japan to the bear cults of Siberia, which hints at a very long thread of meaning. At the French site of Régordu, a possible Neanderthal burial found in association with the bones of a bear has kept the debate alive rather than settling it. The hard problem, the one that runs through all of Stone Age archaeology, is telling deliberate ritual apart from accident. What is certain is that early humans hunted these giants, lived among their skulls, and sometimes handled them with intent. And handling the heads of animals leads to a habit even more direct: wearing them. Number 7. Antler-Frontlet Headdresses. At a waterlogged site in northern England called Starcar, dated to about 11,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered some of the strangest objects in all of European prehistory. They are pieces of red deer skull, still bearing the antlers, that have been carefully worked so a person could wear them on the head. Graham Clark, who excavated the site in the 1950s, recognized them for what they were: headdresses made from the skulls of deer. In total, 21 of these frontlets have been found at Starcar, by far the largest collection of its kind anywhere in the world. The craft is deliberate and skilled. The antlers were trimmed and thinned to reduce their weight. The rough edges of the skull were smoothed, and holes were bored through the bone. Almost certainly so, the frontlet could be tied onto a wearer's head with a strap. This was not a trophy tossed aside. It was equipment, made to be worn. Scholars have argued for two main purposes, and they may not exclude each other. One is practical, a hunting disguise that let a stalker creep close to a herd while looking, at a glance, like one of the deer. The other is ritual, a shamanic headdress worn in ceremony by someone taking on the power or the identity of the animal. Starkar preserved far more than the frontlets. Waterlogged peat on the edge of a long-vanished lake protected wood that would normally rot away, including a timber platform that ranks among the oldest built structures known in Britain, along with barbed points and worked antler that reveal a rich material world. Careful radiocarbon work has placed the occupation across several centuries at the very start of our current warm period, as hunter-gatherers moved back into a Britain emerging from the ice. A handful of similar antler headdresses are known from elsewhere in Europe, such as a site called Bedburg-Königshofen in Germany, but nothing rivals the Starkar set. To pull a deer's skull over your own is to blur the line between human and animal, a theme that runs through shamanic traditions the world over, and the wear on some of the Starkar frontlets suggests they were genuinely used, not merely made and buried. These objects are now icons of the deep human past, displayed in major museums, quiet proof that 11,000 years ago, people were staging themselves as the creatures they lived beside. The next habit left no grand object at all. It is written, instead, into the teeth. Number 8. Interproximal toothpick grooves. If you could examine the teeth of our distant ancestors under a lens, you would find, again and again, tiny smooth channels worn into the sides of the teeth where they meet their neighbors. These are called interproximal grooves, and they are the fossilized signature of a habit so ordinary that we still do it today, picking at our teeth. What astonishes researchers is the age of the behavior. These grooves appear on hominin teeth going back well over 1 million years, into the time of Homo erectus and even earlier forms, which means the habit is older than our own species. The scientist Leslia Halusko tested how such grooves form by dragging grass stalks repeatedly across teeth. Grass carries microscopic particles of silica, and over time, the abrasive stems were exactly the kind of polished channel found on the ancient specimens. This grass stem explanation fits the evidence beautifully. The picks themselves, thin stems, slivers of wood or bone, the small bones of fish almost never survive, so the grooves are usually the only trace left of the tool and the act. The habit is not just idle fidgeting. On some Neanderthal teeth, including a specimen from the Spanish site of Cova Ferrata and others studied by researchers such as Marina Lozano, the grooves sit right beside signs of gum disease and dental trouble, which suggests the picking was aimed at pain, an attempt to clean out or soothe an aching, infected gap between the teeth. In the same vein, Neanderthals appear to have used their front teeth almost as a third hand, gripping and working material, so the mouth was a tool as much as an organ of eating. In that light, toothpicking becomes one of the very oldest forms of self-medication, a crude ancestor of dentistry practiced hundreds of thousands of years before the word existed. The placement and the polish of the grooves show they came from steady, repeated action, a real habit rather than a one-time scratch. What makes this behavior so remarkable is its reach. Nearly every hominin species that has been carefully examined shows it across Africa and Asia, from early Homo to the Neanderthals. Microscopic wear analysis lets scientists tell a toothpick groove apart from the ordinary abrasion of a gritty diet, and studies of hardened dental plaque. The calculus on ancient teeth add to the picture, trapping plant fibers and even traces of medicinal substances. a habit that has survived over 1,000,000 years, passed silently from one generation to the next, turns a trivial modern gesture into one of the deepest inheritances we carry. And another such inheritance blends cleaning with something far more surprising: eating. Number 9. Delousing and eating human lice. Sit behind another person, part their hair, and search it for lice. This act of grooming is shared across the primate world, and among our ancestors it was a daily reality, because for most of human history, nearly everyone carried lice. What turns an ordinary chore into one of the freakier habits on this list is how the search often ended. In many cultures, recorded by travelers and anthropologists again and again, the groomer would crack the captured louse between the teeth and eat it. Part hygiene, part snack, part social ritual, the practice sits on a strange boundary between pest control and food. There is real logic in it. Eating the louse guarantees it will not crawl back into the hair, and it returns a tiny scrap of protein and fat for the effort. Grooming also floods the brain with soothing chemicals and binds people together, which is why our chimpanzee relatives spend hours at it, sometimes eating the parasites they find. In humans, the stakes were higher than comfort, because body lice can carry deadly diseases, including typhus and trench fever, so removing them was a matter of survival, not just tidiness. Lice have shadowed us so faithfully that scientists now read human history in their genes. The researcher David Reed and his colleagues studied the split between head lice and body lice, since body lice can only thrive once people wear clothes. By dating that genetic divergence, they estimated that humans began wearing clothing somewhere between roughly 80,000 and 170,000 years ago, using the parasite as a clock for one of our defining habits. Lice DNA even preserves signals of ancient human migrations and contacts, which is why they are sometimes called molecular fossils of our species. The physical evidence survives too. Preserved lice and their eggs cling to ancient hair, to mummies, and to combs designed to scrape them out, some reaching back well before the age of the pharaohs. Occasionally, the parts of lice turn up in hardened dental plaque or ancient waste, direct proof that they were eaten. Because grooming is universal and so deeply primate, it almost certainly reaches back into the Paleolithic as an inherited routine, survival, and socializing, and the eating of parasites all knotted together in a single quiet act. It is one of the least discussed and most human habits in the whole of prehistory, and the last habit is the most human of all, because it colored the entire deep past a single shade of red. Number 10. Red-Ochre body painting of the living and the dead. If one substance defines the symbolic life of prehistoric humanity, it is red ochre, an earth rich in iron oxide that people have been grinding into pigment for at least 200,000 years. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found a block of ochre engraved with a deliberate cross-hatched pattern, dated to somewhere between about 77,000 and 100,000 years ago, along with a complete paint-making kit built around abalone shells used as containers, from roughly 100,000 years ago. At the site of Twin Rivers in Zambia, ochre use may reach back 200,000 to 300,000 years, into the time before our own species had fully taken shape. People smeared this red earth on their living bodies, almost certainly for decoration and ritual, and probably also for practical reasons, since ochre can shield skin from the sun and help repel insects. But its most haunting use was on the dead. In a cave in Wales lies a famous burial once called the Red Lady of Paviland, in fact a young man who died about 33,000 years ago, whose body was laid down soaked in red ochre. Far to the east, at Sunghir in Russia, burials from around 34,000 years ago hold bodies dusted in ochre and adorned with thousands of painstakingly carved ivory beads. Across Eurasia and later the Americas, the same pattern repeats. The dead sent into the ground, wearing the color of blood. That color is surely the point. Red is the shade of blood and of life, and many researchers believe the reddening of a corpse was an attempt to restore the warmth of living flesh, a symbolic act of revival at the edge of the grave. Ochre had humble uses too, as an ingredient in the glue that fixed stone points to wooden shafts, and as an agent in preparing hides. Neanderthals used red and black mineral pigments as well, so this was not the invention of one kind of human, but a shared inheritance. Worn ochre crayons, stained grinding stones, and pigment carried across long distances all testify to how central the substance was. The pattern is so consistent across the globe that it suggests either a shared origin or the same idea arising again and again in the human mind. Aboriginal Australians have painted their bodies with ochre in ceremony continuously from the Ice Age to the present day. Ochre is, in truth, the oldest cosmetic and among the oldest ritual materials known, used by modern humans, by Neanderthals, and quite possibly by earlier hominins still. To paint the living and the dead in red is perhaps the single most pervasive symbolic habit of the entire human deep past. Lay these 10 habits side by side, and a pattern emerges that is easy to miss when they are told as isolated shocks. Every one of them is an act of taking deliberate control over the body or the mind. Some reach inward through what is swallowed or absorbed, the intoxicating enema, the poisoned honey, the mouthful of clay. Others reshape the flesh itself and leave a permanent mark. The cut of sub-incision, the red stain of ochre worked into the skin. A third group reaches toward meaning through objects and animals. The stacked skulls of cave bears, the antlered headdress pulled over a human face. And a final group hides in the small maintenance of daily life, the endless picking of the teeth, the grooming and eating of lice. Seen this way, the word freaky begins to dissolve. Behind almost every habit lies a working logic, the neutralizing of poisons, the treatment of pain, the binding of a group, the marking of a life stage, the search for the sacred. These were not the flailings of confused minds, but the strategies of intelligent people meeting hunger, sickness, cold, and mortality with the only tools they had, their bodies and their beliefs. Many of the habits run astonishingly deep, some older than our species, and several appear on distant continents and among different kinds of humans, which tells us they answer something basic in what we are. There is another pattern worth naming. Several of these habits sit at the exact boundary between the practical and the sacred, and refuse to stay on one side. Ochre repels insects, and also carries the dead into the ground. Clay disarms a poison, and also settles a pregnant woman's stomach. A toothpick eases an infection, while a deer's skull turns a hunter into something more than a hunter. The people who did these things did not divide the world into the useful and the holy, the way a modern museum label does. The reason they have faded from the familiar story of prehistory is not that they are unimportant. It is that they are uncomfortable, and comfort tends to edit the past. A fair question hangs over all of this. How can anyone claim to know what people did tens of thousands of years ago, when the acts themselves left no writing and often no obvious object? The answer is that behavior fossilizes in indirect ways, and learning to read those traces is the whole craft of prehistoric archaeology. Hardened waste, called coprolites, preserves what people ate, including clay and parasites. The plaque locked onto ancient teeth traps, plant fibers, and even medicines. Worn grooves and abraded enamel record the motions of the hands and mouth across a lifetime. Certain places preserve far more than others. Waterlogged sites like Starcar protect wood, antler, and fiber that would rot anywhere dry, opening a window onto the perishable gear of ritual. The genetics of lice and of ancient diseases let scientists date behaviors like the wearing of clothing. Now and then, chemistry confirms a written memory. as when the symptoms Xenophon described match gray anotoxin exactly, or when ochre can be traced to a specific distant source. But the evidence has limits, and honesty demands naming them. The arrangement of cave bear skulls may be ritual, or may be the work of water and time. Comparisons with living cultures can illuminate the past or mislead us with false certainty. Rituals that lived only in soft tissue and gesture leave almost nothing behind. Where doubt exists, it belongs in the story. Run through the list again, and a striking picture forms of prehistoric people as experimenters, with their own bodies as the laboratory. They understood, without any theory of anatomy, that a substance taken through the gut behaves differently from the same substance delivered by another route, and they exploited that difference on purpose. They handled deadly poisons like mad honey and concentrated tobacco with a sense of dose, learning how much brought vision and how much brought death, and paying in lives for the knowledge. They discovered that a mouthful of the right clay could disarm the toxins in an otherwise inedible plant, turning the earth itself into an antidote. The same experimental spirit shows in the smaller habits. Picking at an aching tooth to relieve the pressure of infection is a form of self-treatment. And so, in its way, is eating clay for a sick stomach or a difficult pregnancy. Endurance was tested and displayed through the body. The initiate, who took the blade in silence, converting pain into social standing. All of this amounts to a folk pharmacology and a folk medicine built entirely without writing, carried forward in memory and imitation across hundreds of generations. Consider that the same clay chemistry a modern factory uses to make an anti-diarrheal tablet was already being exploited by people dipping bitter potatoes in mud, and that the concentrated tobacco in a ritual enema was a controlled dose of one of the most powerful natural insecticides on the planet. The boundary between healing and ritual was thin and often absent, the same act serving to cure a body and to bind it into a community. What looks freaky from a heated, well-fed present was, in its own world, careful, hard-won practical knowledge, tested against the harshest possible judge, survival itself. For all that has been pieced together, the honest edges of the subject are ragged with open questions. We do not know whether early humans truly entered a state of torpor in their winter caves, or simply starved through the season, their bones bearing witness either way. We cannot say for certain whether the skulls in Drachenloch were gathered by reverent hands, or merely swept together by water and the slow settling of a cave floor. We do not know how far back the intoxicating enema really goes, only that several cultures had arrived at it. We cannot date the true origin of Sub-Incision, hidden as it is in perishable flesh and living tradition. Nor can we read the exact thoughts of the person who first pulled a deer's skull over their head, whether it was a hunter's trick, a dancer's costume, or a sacred transformation, or all three at once. We do not know how common mad honey intoxication was across the wider prehistoric world, or whether the near-universal habit of burying the dead in Red-Ochre reflects one shared ancestral belief, or the same idea born over and over in separate minds. We also cannot always tell how widely a habit was shared. A practice attested at one spectacular site, like the Antler-Frontlets of Starkar, might have been common across a whole continent, or unique to a single band of people, and the difference matters enormously for the story we tell. These gaps are not failures. They are the reason the field keeps digging, keeps refining its methods, keeps returning to old bones with new instruments, sometimes overturning a confident claim from a century ago with a single new measurement. Every unresolved debate is an invitation, a place where the deep past still refuses to fully explain itself. Set against the polished image many people carry of the prehistoric world, these habits can feel like aberrations, embarrassing detours from the march toward civilization. They are nothing of the kind. They are ingenuity under pressure, the record of clever, curious, enduring people solving the problems of survival with the resources they had. The same species that would one day raise cathedrals and map the stars also ate clay to survive a bitter harvest wore the skulls of animals to hunt and to prey, and painted its dead the color of living blood. The word freaky, in the end, is a judgment made from the comfort of the present, from a world of medicine and full stomachs and central heat. Strip that comfort away and the rules change, and behaviors that seem shocking reveal themselves as reasonable, even wise. And the deepest of these habits never truly left us. We still pick our teeth, still prize honey, still reach for red pigment to mark what matters, still groom and bond, and endure. Looking back at the freakiest things prehistoric humans did is really a way of looking into a mirror and discovering how much of what we call normal is simply the freakiness we have grown used to. The people in that mirror were not lesser versions of us. They were us, already inventive, already reaching for meaning, working out how to live in the only world they had.